Fishing in Alaska is like your entire body taking a breath of fresh air. But Alaska is brutal. Between the immense amount of snow, freezing temperatures, winters where the sun doesn't rise, and summers with endless amounts of sun, you still have to watch out for predatory animals at every turn in the wilderness. Yet those who live there love the place, and those who temporarily come can't wait to return for more. Alaska is the outdoor lover's paradise. The sunlight cascades over mountains, through thick forests, down winding rivers, and into the hearts of those who visit. But as with everything beautiful, calm, and serene, Mother Nature keeps its wilderness carefully balanced. Thick and dense darkness can overcome the happiest of emotions, and what happens when that light goes out? Welcome to Tragedy with a View. I am going to preface this entire episode with that I pulled a lot of direct quotes directly from the book that I read in preparation for this. The book is called Beyond the Bear, and it is written by Dan Bigley and Deborah McKinney, and it was a really, really, really good book. There's a lot of emotion in it, and you can just tell, this is the story about Dan Bigley, by the way, and you can just tell that his personality and his optimism and light really just shines through the words. I would also like to thank Sam for bearing with this episode today, because he's had to listen.
Bearing with this episode.
He's had to listen to me talk about this for like 2 months, and as someone who's not a super morbid lover,
bears are important in this household. I only respect the statute.
Good answer. Good response. I want to also reiterate something that I said in the last episode, but I think the audio might have not been super great in that one. And it looks like I've got a couple of younger listeners here, and I just want to say it again, especially because it is very applicable to this episode. We cover some really gruesome and gory and terrible events that occur in nature, but also to people. And these people experienced these horrific things, and I can't appropriately tell the story and the impact that these events had on their lives without giving you the details, and because of that, listener discretion is advised. I also want to say that this is going to be a 2-part episode. I'm not going to make you wait 2 weeks for the second part.
I don't think they could bear it. Ha 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 ha.
I'm not going to make you wait 2 weeks for the next episode. It is going to come out in 1 week. I will tell you, though, that this is the worst of the 2 episodes. This one goes a lot into the injuries and the actual events that took place, where the second episode focuses a lot more on the medical recovery. So, as I already said, listener discretion is advised. If you're queasy about medicine or really graphic details, proceed with caution. That's what I'll tell you. And as I already mentioned, I'm going to tell you Dan Bigley's story, and I want to start off with some really early background, because I think that Dan is just such a light in this world, and he is extremely adventurous and loves the outdoors, and his life is a testament to that. Dan Bigley was born premature, tiny and thin, was ill and had allergies to a variety of things, and then as he was growing, he developed deafness as a toddler. This was corrected with surgery, however, his speech was delayed, and he was determined not to allow that to slow him down. When Dan was in the 5th grade, he found out that he had a love for swimming and seemed to be naturally able to hold his breath for a long time, which meant that he used that skill to show off, and once he held his breath for so long that he passed out, and he did this trying to impress a girl.
Surprise.
Dan grew up in Ohio and moved to California, and during his grade school years, Dan and his brother Brian would spend part of each summer with their grandparents In their home on Clearwater Lake in Ontario, Canada, they had 2 ways to get to the property, and that was either by boat or float plane. Every day they could, their grandfather would take them fishing on the lake for walleye, trout, and bass, and then they would fillet the fish for their grandmother to cook up for dinner that evening. Dan and Brian both learned many lessons and skills from their grandfather, and that would carry into their adult lives. Dan spent his middle school years in Malaysia because his stepfather was involved with a palm oil processing plant that was being built there. And while in Malaysia, Dan attended the International School of Kuala Lumpur, and classes regularly included kayaking, hiking through the jungle, and much more as activities, so much so that they were required to have leech-proof socks.
Why don't they have those classes in America?
Yes, that is a good question.
Sign me up.
But the YMCA, not locally, of course, because Ohio is lame, but the YMCA has some really intense camps and whatnot that you can do. And
Whoa.
A slightly older Dan and friends were adventurous and free. Some of the things they did included stripping naked and climbing on a driftwood log to ride it down the Merced River in the high Sierras, and then they had to hike back up to get their clothes and packs naked and barefoot. Another time, Dan and 2 friends hid in the weeds as they saw a helicopter approach a meadow near Mount Whitney that they had been hiking in. Once they saw all the men leave the chopper, they army crawled over to it, found a camera, and then mooned the camera while taking photos.
What rapscallions?
What is that word? Rapscallions.
Rapscallions.
It sounds like you should have like armor and
a mischievous person.
Okay.
Mischievous persons in this case.
Rapscallions. Okay.
See, I was perfectly on brand, player.
You were.
Good for me.
What's the saying? What do they say now? What do the kids say now? That tracks.
Yes.
Okay. Dan had encounters with bears. However, none of them were life-altering. For example, he once saw a bear on the Clune Lake who was laying on its back, tossing a piece of driftwood into the air and catching it again. Before his freshman year at Prescott, Dan took a Sierra Institute Wilderness Field Study course, and while staying in Mammoth Lakes in California, he woke up one morning to a black bear sniffing his face. And then on a separate field study course...
It's almost foreshadowing.
Unintended, I'm sure.
Nature was trying to communicate with him. Continue.
And then on a separate field study course with the Sierra Institute, Dan and his group were followed by a mama bear and her cubs who tried to knock their food out of a tree for 5 days before the group was finally able to get away from the bears. Dan had only ever been charged by one animal in all of the time that he spent outdoors, and that animal happened to be a porcupine.
They are vicious.
They are... Don't they run backwards?
I don't think so. That's a skunk.
I thought that they... If an enemy persists, they run backwards until they ram their attacker with their quills. Because I thought
so they actually go towards them.
Yeah. They don't like shoot their quills out. That's not how they get into you. They ram them into you.
Oh.
Skunks just spray. So of course a skunk would. Well, I don't think skunks run backwards either, but they do turn their butt to you and give you a good squirt.
Give you a good Pepe the Pew.
They're pretty docile though.
We would know.
We
have encountered them in the wild.
My barn. Were we
no
dating?
tragedies occurred.
Were we dating yet when all of that was happening? Okay.
Pepe walks right in front of me.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And you were inside, and we had a nice chat.
Did you?
He did not squirt me.
I'm glad to hear that. They're pretty docile.
You would have known.
You have to do something pretty big to make a skunk spray you. Back to the story. As an adult, Dan stood 6 foot 4 inches, had green eyes, a red beard, and sun blonde hair. He graduated from Prescott College in Arizona with a degree in natural history and a minor in environmental education. On July 14th, 2003, Dan was feeling on top of the world. At 25 years old, he had found himself a rewarding job working with children who had severe emotional trauma. He had purchased a cabin in Bear Valley in the Chugach Mountains outside of Anchorage, Alaska, which often experienced wind gusts that met the requirements for Category 1 and sometimes Category 2 hurricanes. And to top it off, he was finally dating Amber, who he had been interested in for a year. Prior to buying his cabin, Dan lived in Girdwood and had found friends with guys who would hold potlucks and jam sessions and participated in outdoor activities including skiing, fishing, kayaking, climbing, hiking, and paragliding from the mountaintops.
Girdwood seems on brand for this guy.
Yeah. Girdwood was really popular for bear encounters and sightings. Bear would often look for food, either human or dog food, or any other animal food that was thrown in trash cans or outdoor storage containers. And Dan studied bears in his senior year at Prescott College. Based on his studies, he thought that bears were more accepting and passive towards humans than humans were of bears. Dan's work as an activity therapist for Alaska Children's Services meant that he worked with children who, as I said, suffered severe emotional trauma. Some of these children had been abused, addicted, and abandoned, and ended up in group homes rather than foster care. Dan used his education to help calm the kids that he worked with. Outside of work and music, Dan loved fishing. Dan and his buddy John Duray had planned to go fishing, and John arrived at Dan's house at around 10:30 a.m. on Monday, July 14th, 2003, to go fishing at the Russian River near the Kenai Peninsula. Dan loaded his gear into John's car, called for his dog Maya, a lab mix, and then set off. John and Dan became friends the summer prior while working in security for Girdwood Forest Fair. They had similar interests and taught each other several skills in activities, including rolling a kayak. And John, who had worked at the Russian River campground for 2 summers, was able to show Dan where all of the best fishing holes were located.
This guy reminds me of Teddy Roosevelt. He
Dan?
started out sick when he was a young kid. Then he used exercise and swimming to make himself strong again. Then he pursued love, and now he done a billion different jobs like forestry and security and whatever. That's a good connection.
A good, strong personality.
Yeah.
Canucks, or king salmon, were Dan's favorite type of salmon to fish for, with their aggressive fight-for-life mentality. The Kenai River holds the world record for a 97-pound, 4-ounce king salmon having been caught by rod and reel. And I'm pretty sure I have a picture. I'm going to post these pictures on social media, but I also would like to show you the picture of this fish.
Whoa. The only thing I know about fishing is to make your fish look larger, you gotta hold it up and then you gotta hide your elbow. Because then people don't have a frame of reference on how big your fish is, and then they'll be like, wow, that's huge! That's my only fishing hot tip.
Pro tip.
Yes.
Because that's what's important, is how big your fish is.
It's true. What do you think they take pictures for?
Dan's second favorite salmon was the reds, or sockeye salmon, and it was the sockeye that they were after this day. Sockeye were also aggressive and hard to reel in, as well as hard to bring all the way in for a meal. Sometimes they would simply spit out the hook, snap the line, and even play dead until the fisher had the hook removed on the riverbank, and then suddenly they would leap from the hands, flop across the riverbank, and back into the water, with fishermen chasing behind. Because reds were notorious for spitting out hooks, the local emergency room at Central Peninsula Hospital was accustomed to removing hooks from faces and even elbows of fishermen who were standing in the way when a hook came flying out of the water at them. Dan was a fan of fly fishing, and the only way to legally catch salmon is by using a technique called flossing, which takes advantage of the way fish breathe as they make their way upriver. During the spawning season, the fish force their way upstream, and in their drive to continue their species, they stop eating, so lures or baits are useless. Salmon repeatedly open and close their mouths, and this is how they breathe and move water through their gills. So to catch these fish, you have to get your line in the water, and as it's dragged back, you catch the fish as its mouth is open while your hook is bouncing along in the current. Some of the illegal ways, without giving anyone ideas, include what type of hook or bait you are using a net or some sort of trap, as well as hooking the fish anywhere other than inside of the mouth.
It seems very odd that they have so many regulations for salmon. It's like, do they have rules like that for other fish?
Well, I think yeah. I mean, it's the same concept as buying a tag for hunting deer.
Oh.
There's only a certain number that you're allowed to harvest from the environment without essentially causing the environment to go crazy because you killed off all of the prey source for a certain type of animal. Or, for example, if we were allowed to open an open season on bears, all of these grazing animals would then just
explode
and thrive, and they wouldn't have any predators, and it would just cause the entire ecosystem to shift. So they have a very specific calculation.
I guess it's like why they have bow season and then gun season methods.
Well, yeah, there are different methods, but there's also just doing it the right way, so not like just murdering animals
inhumanely.
Yeah, you do it in a respectful way. With the sheer amount of fish in the rivers, this flossing technique is actually easier than it sounds, and regularly fishermen are maxing out their days. The unfortunate side effect of this is that the more fish mean more fishermen, which mean more fish are being cleaned and gutted before the fishermen are leaving, which draws bears in for an easy meal of the fish carcasses left behind. And fish were not only being cleaned at the river and on the banks, but also at campgrounds and in parking lots as well. In an effort to combat this, the United States Forest Service installed these fish cleaning stations that were positioned so that fishermen could throw the carcass into the main current of the river. The idea being that it would not only carry the carcass away, but it would also provide the nutrients into the river and the aquatic life. Unfortunately, this is not what happened. Instead, the carcasses became caught on rocks and created a backlog which drew bears. Bears are incredibly smart, and while they normally would go further down the river where the salmon were closer to spawning and dying off, meaning that they were easier for the bear to grab, along with the shallower water, meaning that any fish that had the energy to fight for their life was limited in the space that it could move. Despite this, the fact that this backlog created by the cleaning station consisted of 114,000 pounds or 57 tons annually became such an easy meal that the bears simply couldn't pass it by. A single bear can eat as many as 30 fish per day, so obviously they're going to go where they don't have to work as hard for their food. Further, cubs with their mothers learn that this is a source of food, and while it is not the typical people-mean-food relationship, they still learn that this time of year and this activity means that they get to feast. After years of this, the Alaskan Department of Fish and Game recognized that they created an artificial food source for the bears. But every plan they came up with had a downside. The sheer number of fishermen compiling in a 5-month fishing season also trampled the riverbanks and vegetation into a pulp. So fences were put up and boardwalks were installed, which allowed the vegetation to thrive and grow, and it created a wall of grass and bush that meant it was difficult for fishermen to see bears and bears to see the humans. In 2003, black and grizzly bears, or brown bears, were being seen in unusually high numbers as they paced the river, and this was because the salmon were resting down river, delaying their normal time frame for coming through this particular part of the Russian River. But this created a really tense situation for the bears, especially the sows, or mama bears, and their cubs, who were very tense with the male bears or boars showing up, as the boars would sometimes kill cubs. All of them were hungry and waiting for food, and this created even more tension, even with the bears that were without cubs.
So just a quick note on that, if you want to explain. So bear males will kill cubs so that they will now have a potential mate. Is that correct?
Yeah. So bear cubs will stay with their mothers for, depending on the species and quite honestly depending on the bear, like 2 to 3 years. And during that time, the female bear will not go into heat. So male bears don't get, her pheromones and her scent that she's ready to mate and produce more offspring. So a way that they can kind of get those sows into heat is by getting rid of her cubs, which means that 2 to 3 year period gets wiped out.
Now you know.
Now you know. And that's that way for a lot of animals, is the males will kill babies, especially if they're not their own. Early in the season, a sow had charged through a fence at a couple of fishermen, one of which shot her in self-defense, and she was wounded and was later found dead, with her 3 cubs up in a tree. It was determined that these cubs were the sow's cubs, and with her death came the death of the cubs, who were euthanized when they were unable to locate a zoo or wildlife facility to take them. Another report was made over a different sow with 3 cubs who charged a couple as they accidentally crossed the river between the sow and her cubs. The sow charged them, stopped about 20 feet away, slapped the water with her front paws, snapped her jaw, and huffed at them. And those are some really good signs that even before the bear has charged you, they'll sometimes do this behavior where they're slapping the ground and snapping their teeth together and making some angry sounds. And that's typically like your first clue that you need to get out of there. The tension was clear, yet this didn't slow down the fishermen as they waded into the river. John and Dan's first stop of their fishing day began with them going to a spot with a steep embankment on one side, resulting in only 15 able to fish at a time. This often created a line, but John and Dan were happy to wait. After about 15 minutes of waiting, both John and Dan were able to get spots to start fishing, and it didn't take long for their lines to start hitting their marks. After a few hours, John and Dan had 3 reds in their cooler, which were caught within the first 45 minutes and was half of their allowed day limit. So the limit at this point in time, at least for salmon, was 3 per fisher per day.
See, the question that I want to ask is, I wonder if these fishermen get fisherman anxiety because there's people waiting behind them. If I was there, I'd be like, come on, fishy, hurry up, because there's about 10 people behind me.
And this is why you don't go.
Yeah.
Don't do salmon fishing.
Pretty much.
Yeah, you gotta.
Too much pressure.
You gotta forget about them.
You gotta get in the zone.
Let them get their fish when they have a spot. There's plenty of fish.
There are.
Plenty of fish.
That's what I'm noticing.
Yeah. They continued to fish for a few more hours before deciding to head out. They went for burgers and beer, and while eating their meal, they overheard others talking about the salmon being holed up at the sanctuary, which is a location near where the Kenai and Russian rivers join together. All it took was one look, and John and Dan decided that they were going there next. They called up their friends Jeremy Anderson, who goes by Jaha, and both he and his girlfriend Emily decided to join John and Dan. About 8:30 p.m., they pulled into the Russian River campgrounds, and the group initially started fishing at a location called Cottonwood Hole. After fishing unsuccessfully, Dan and John decided to head to a different location, and Emily and Jaha stayed behind. Emily was kind of new to the scene, and she wasn't comfortable with the amount of bears near the location that Dan and John were heading to, so the group decided to meet up in the campgrounds at around 10:30 later that night. Dan and John split towards the sanctuary, and after about an hour, they had finally caught the 3 fish they needed to reach their maximum limit. Knowing they were running behind, they hoofed it to the cleaning station and began cleaning their fish when they bumped into a friend who mentioned to them to be really careful, as there had been a ton of bear activity that night. Meanwhile, Emily and Jaha continued to fish where they were, and when they were finished, they made their way up to the parking lot where they found the locked car. Around 11 p.m., they noticed a bunch of people had congregated in one area and wandered over to check it out. The sun hadn't officially set yet, but it had dipped below the mountains, creating a hazy sort of light. Walking over to see what the commotion was about, they found it was bears. What they saw specifically was a sow with 2 cubs running through the water. They must have started on the other side of the river and were heading towards the side with the parking lot they were standing in. The sow was clearly agitated, her head on a swivel, slapping the water with her front paws and acting irritated that her cubs weren't listening. The cubs exited the river near Angler Trail, which ran parallel to the river, and the sow cut into the woods shortly behind them. Finishing up, Dan and John started to walk out, Maya with them, and they did their best to make sure that they were heard, which is a really good tactic to not have a run-in with a bear in the first place.
All right, bear spray, talk loud.
Yeah, make noise. So there's also bear bells that you can get that jingle. You add it to your pack and it jingles.
Oh.
But there's been information showing that does not.
It's not human enough.
Yeah.
That's kind of a cool idea.
Yeah, which I guess is you know, there's.
You should just carry around a radio.
Well, that's actually.
Or listen to this podcast.
You should. You should listen to this podcast. But that's the thing, is that there's with technology, is that people have their Bluetooth speakers and they have it attached to their pack or their kayak or whatever, and they're just blaring music as they're going down. And while sure, it may be enjoyable for you and it might be a good tactic to keep predatory animals away, a lot of other people hate it. And hate it when people have their music just blaring. So, you know,
be respectful.
Be respectful. Maybe don't have it on at full volume. Bears' ears are better than ours. They're going to hear you much sooner than you hear them. So, there's that. Reaching the turn where Angler Trail meets. So backing up, John and Dan are walking out. They have Maya with them, and they're talking and, you know, having a good time. Reaching the turn where Angler Trail meets the path to the stairs that go to the campground, Maya suddenly glues herself to Dan's leg and lets out a low growl, and they all immediately stop moving. Approximately 30 feet in front of Dan and John was a bear, facing away from them, standing on the path. First, looking over her shoulder, she turned to face Dan and John. Being bear smart, John backed up so that Dan and John would be next to each other to look bigger, and Dan reached down for Maya's collar. The bear had her hackles rise and was wolfing and swaying back and forth on her front paws. She was standing her ground as well, which both John and Dan found alarming. Slowly and telepathically, they decided the best thing to do would be to back up. Clearly, she wasn't taking off at the sight of them as other bears had done, so it was up to them to clear out of the area. They backed up until they rounded the corner of the trail and then decided to take a roundabout way to the parking lot so that they could really give the bear some space. Walking along the path as quickly as they could, they were on the boardwalk that ran parallel to the parking lot and would meet up with a separate trail to lead back to the parking lot in a different way. Neither Dan or John had any sort of bear deterrent or source of protection with them. When Dan let go of Maya, he was feeling relieved and they started to relax, and Dan started to talk about how pissed that bear seemed. Their quick thinking helped them get out of a sketchy situation, and both felt that they had dodged a bullet. And then, suddenly, they were brought to a halt again as the brush ahead of them began shaking. Instantly knowing that the bear must have done the same thing that they had done and walked parallel to the parking lot, John and Dan turned around and walked quickly as they could in the opposite direction to give the clearly irate bear some breathing room. And then, from around the corner, in front of them, dipping her shoulder to make the turn, the bear was running at them. Her head was low, her ears were pinned to her head, and as she ran past Maya, she swiped at her. But she didn't stop to incapacitate her. John, next in line, launched himself so hard off of the trail as the bear swiped at him that he came out of his waiter's shoes. Still not stopping, the bear came barreling down the path. Dan felt the fire in her eyes locked on him. Dan turned, ran a couple of steps before launching himself into the brush as well. Unfortunately for Dan, the bear was already at her top speed, and she grabbed his left thigh before he hit the ground. Time slowed down. Dan, laying face down with his hands clasped behind his neck, felt himself getting pulled from the brush and back onto the trail. Playing dead, Dan could hear screaming, and the sound made him sick. It almost didn't sound human. To him, it clearly sounded like an animal was in immense distress. In fact, it must be dying. He hadn't realized that the screams were coming from himself. Meanwhile, John was army crawling through the brush, and once he felt he was a safe distance away, he stood and ran, screaming for help as he ran back to Cottonwood Hole, where he, Dan, Jaha, and Emily had been fishing earlier that day. After a moment, John realized that Dan was no longer screaming and started directing his screams at him, yelling, "Dan! Dan, are you okay?" John softly heard a moan, and then the screams began again. Back on the trail, Dan had passed out, and when he heard John calling for him, he groaned. The bear, as bears do, was standing nearby, and they do this to make sure that what they determined to be a threat, Dan in this case, was actually nullified. Hearing him groan triggered her already enraged state to attack again. The bear grabbed a hold of Dan, shook him like a rag doll, and then started dragging him off of the trail, where she dropped him after about 25 feet. Dan's head was bouncing off of the ground and rocks, and one of them knocked him out. Dan came back to, smelling the bear's breath and feeling it on his face, and that was when he realized that she had flipped him over while he had been unconscious. The bear, standing over him, had her front paws on his shoulders, pinning him to the ground. She turned her head sideways, opened her mouth wide, and then bit down across his face. Dan heard his bones crunching, a hideous pop, and then everything went quiet as he felt absorbed by a blue light. In this moment, he felt detached from reality, describing it as being pleasant, no fear, and no pain. It was in this time that he realized in order to live, he would have to make the conscious effort to do so. Knowing that it meant taking the hard road and that he would need to fight for life, Dan says he didn't even consider the alternative. Coming back to Earth, Dan was curled in the fetal position on the forest floor in complete darkness. As Dan came back to full consciousness, he noticed that what began as a small amount of pain quickly became deep, throbbing, and all-encompassing pain. Pain like anything he'd ever imagined pain could feel like. Dan could feel blood running down his throat and gagged because of it. As he tried to shout, he realized he couldn't get his voice to work. Next, he tried crawling, but his arms felt like they were attached to someone else, and his legs felt like jello. Dan could hear the blood dripping off of his face and onto the ground, as well as his boot filling with blood. At this moment, and I'm putting this in solely for you, Sam. He thought to himself, "Oh man, I have to work in the morning, and now I'm probably going to be late."
Dang. What a struggle. What a trooper. This guy, dedicated to the job. Hire him on the spot.
Then Dan began to shiver. Just a bit at first, and then they became violent. The bear left him in some tall grass off of the trail just below the Kenai Peninsula's Russian River campground. So close to the parking lot, in fact, that those there heard the attack. Back in the parking lot, shortly after Jaha and Emily lost sight of the bears, a group of 4 men entered the trail, and Jaha tried to warn them of the angry sow they just saw. The group of men just replied, "Yeah, thanks. We're from here. We've got guns. We ain't worried about no bears." It wasn't long after that the screams began. Jaha assumed the sow attacked the group of 4 men they just witnessed, screaming to ask them if they were okay in the silence that followed. And then, roaring, more screaming, thrashing, and a farther off voice screaming for help. Jaha, unable to just sit there, started down the stairs when he suddenly turned and yelled for Emily to run. He had a crazed look in his eye, and just behind them, the cubs were coming up the stairs, and the sow was charging up the incline directly below where Emily was waiting. Jaha and Emily went sprinting for the restrooms, which were bear-proof, but thinking they didn't have that much time, Emily changed direction toward a Chevy Blazer with a back window busted out. Jaha, who was a couple of paces behind her, dove in as well. As he did so, he was able to get a close-up look at the sow and noticed that her mouth was smeared with blood. Emily and Jaha scrambled into the front seat and then ducked down to get out of sight of the bear. They heard the sow circle the Blazer twice, and then Emily reached up and laid on the horn. The bears at this point took off. John, calling for help while standing in the river, was approached by 2 Alaskan National Guardsmen, Sergeants David Robertson and Brian Irby, who had been out fishing and found Maya wandering. John was able to hold himself together as he told them Dan had just been attacked by a bear. Hoping there was safety in numbers, the 3 of them worked their way up the trail to find Dan. Once at the attack site, they saw the gouges in the earth as if something heavy had been drug, along with a trail of blood. Adding to the chaos of the scene, a fishing pole, Dan's hat, and waiter's shoes were strewn about the area. Then they heard moaning. Locating Dan, David Robertson pulled off his t-shirt and used it to apply pressure to get Dan's face to stop bleeding, and Brian Irby checked Dan for more wounds. Worried, David and Brian decided they needed to go for help and had John hold pressure to Dan's face. Once Dan and John were alone, John broke down. Between David's quick action in yanking off his shirt and pressing it to Dan's face, and John being so happy to see that Dan was alive, he missed that Dan's face was a pulp filled with grime and debris, and that his eyes were hanging down where his nose should have been. Dan, at this point, was conscious enough to help John treat his wounds. Dan had trained as a wilderness first responder and was worried he would bleed out, so he instructed John on what to do and where to apply pressure.
Wait, what? Dan said that? Dan's awake and conscious enough to give instruction?
Yeah.
Holy moly.
Yeah. Hire him on the spot. Back in the parking lot, Jaha climbed out of the Blazer, and after a brief discussion with Emily, he left to offer his assistance. He left to offer his assistance to whoever had been attacked. Running to the nearest rig in the campground, Jaha pounded on the door until Frank Valentine answered. Frank and his wife had assumed that the ruckus was from kids throwing a party, but Jaha and Emily quickly explained that they had been charged by an angry sow and that she had attacked someone near the stairs. Frank grabbed his .44 Magnum, pulled on shoes and a sweatshirt, and headed into the night. Meanwhile, Emily locked herself in the bathrooms at the campground. Which,
smart.
Same. I think...
Actually, question. What makes something bear-proof, officially?
I don't know about bathrooms, but bear-resistant containers are defined as securable containers constructed of a solid, non-pliable material capable of withstanding a minimum of 300 foot-pounds of energy.
I see.
I would imagine that it's like not a porta potty. Like, I feel like a bear could get into that. And as I said previously, bears are really super smart. They're able to figure out how to get into things.
Well, that's why I was so surprised when we were in Washington. All the trash cans were very, they were unique. Like, you had to press a button and push in a certain way and then pull it open. It's like they try to make them animal-proof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's animals. Way
Smart
more animals. Here in Ohio, our biggest threat are squirrels.
Raccoons.
I think squirrels are probably worse. Maybe.
Raccoon versus squirrel. Who do you think would win?
That's a good question to ask. I'm going to put a note. Because Spotify, if you don't know, Spotify has now questions that you can ask with each episode. What would be worse to be attacked by? A squirrel or a raccoon? Please leave your answers below if you're listening on Spotify. Okay. So Emily locked herself in the bathrooms, which, as I said, I probably would do the same. I would like to think that I would run to go help out. But I also have this constant rotation of you've got a kid at home running through my head, and it causes me not to take risks in the same way that I did before I became a mom.
I think that that's normal, and if you actually did want to help people, you need to prime yourself. But for active shooter situations, you're supposed to, or dangerous situations, you're supposed to prime yourself to be I'm going to, if something happens, this is what I'm going to do. Because that's the whole, when you freeze.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not primed to act, then
you
will not do anything. Or you'll revert back to your base form, which would be whatever that would be.
Yeah.
Usually fear and running.
Yes. As Jaha and Frank made their way down the trail, John heard them and ran out in front of them. Upon seeing John, Jaha asked, "Where's Dan?" To which John replied by walking back into the brush, lifting the t-shirt and saying, "This is Dan." Frank Valentine, who is a former U.S. Army Ranger and combat veteran, had served 3 tours in Vietnam, reeled at the sight. Looking at Dan, he described what he saw as if a grenade had gone off in Dan's face. Pulling out his cell phone, Frank dialed 911 and was shocked to get through. He was able to get out their location that a man had been attacked by a bear and they needed a medevac immediately, and then the call dropped. After several attempts to reconnect to 911, Frank's phone rang. It was the dispatcher calling to tell him that troopers and EMTs were on their way. Jaha, taking over for John, suggested that he go back up to the campground and check on Emily, as she had locked herself in the bathroom and needed to be informed on what was happening. While waiting for medical personnel to arrive, Jaha kept close watch on Dan's pulse. At one point, it was erratic, then weak, and then stopped. Positioning to start CPR, Jaha placed his hands on Dan's chest, and just before loading for the first compression, Dan, like he was being yanked from the bottom of a pool, took a huge breath. Word spread quickly, and a group soon assembled to stand guard around Dan. Most had guns, others had flashlights and headlamps, and others offered jackets and space blankets to help Dan stay warm. Todd Wilson, the first of many first responders called out of bed, was the chief of the Cooper's Landing Volunteer Fire Department, quickly arrived on scene, and when he got there, he questioned the t-shirt. Jaha, trying to keep his voice low so that Dan wouldn't hear him, insisted that he didn't want to know. After a moment of back and forth, Todd pulled the corner of the t-shirt back and then quickly replaced it. Todd set to work checking Dan's vitals and cutting open his waders to check for more injuries instead. Around 1 a.m., Carrie Williams, a volunteer level 3 emergency medical technician, and her partner, Phil Weber, arrived with the ambulance. Carrie went down the trail to check Dan first, while Phil waited in the ambulance with a radio for orders. Carrie, a mother and grandmother, was in EMT mode, which helped her stay focused on the task and not allow emotions to take over. Assessing the situation, she called up to Phil, telling him they needed a backboard, CV collar, heat packs, IVs, and oxygen, along with a variety of other medical equipment and accessories. Bystanders helped carry the gear down to Dan and Carrie, and then stood back while Phil and Carrie went to work stabilizing Dan. They inserted IVs into both of his arms, suctioned blood from his mouth, and held the oxygen mask over his mouth since his face was too damaged to hold the mask in place. Placing the neck brace and loading Dan onto the backboard, Carrie started organizing people to assist her with extracting Dan from the forest floor and taking his 6'4" frame up the stairs and to the ambulance. She enlisted help for 2 men at the front, 2 men in the back, and then 2 more on each side, with Carrie being on one of those sides to keep an eye on Dan. She also organized extra men to be close by in the event that one became tired, they could switch out immediately. Once Dan was loaded into the ambulance, Eric Christian spoke up that he was an EMT and offered his help in the ambulance. Wes Masters and Tom Swish also volunteered to ride along and assist in Dan's care while on the ride to the helicopter. En route to the helicopter, Dan began questioning why he was able to hear people talking but couldn't see anyone. Before anyone was able to answer, Dan began to vomit the blood that he had been swallowing. The crew, acting quickly, turned the backboard on its side to prevent Dan from drowning. The location chosen to be the improvised landing pad for the helicopter was near Resurrection Trail, which seems on brand.
Fitting.
The highway had been shut down in both directions, with vehicles creating a physical block. A fire truck was parked under electrical wires to make them visible, and flares were used to light up the area that the helicopter would land in. Around 2:30 a.m., the helicopter arrived. 2 critical care flight nurses leapt from the helicopter once it landed, quickly were updated by Carrie, and then they were rushing Dan toward the helicopter, where they loaded him and closed the door. Okay, back in the parking lot, John was with Emily, Maya, and Jaha, and he was already suffering from survivor's guilt. Once they heard the helicopter coming, John was convinced by the others that he could go home. Instead, he went to Dan's place and woke up his roommate, Jamie Berggren. After filling Jamie in on what happened to Dan, they both made their way to the hospital in Anchorage, and that is where we're going to end this episode.
Dun dun dun.
So we'll You'll get the rest of it next week.
He chose to come back.
Chose, yeah. Yeah, that's mm-hmm. When you're walking in the wild, be sure to watch your step. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and review to be the first to hear our bi-weekly episodes. Please find and like us at Tragedy with a View on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. If you have a story of your own that involves the great outdoors, we would love to hear it. Please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Thank you again for listening. We'll see you next time.